Hey, this is Gaming Bench. You name the games, we run the benchmarks. And today I've got a new one that was kind of not even on my radar, but I saw some postings about it and it looked interesting. It's called Enotria, The Last Song. It's based on Italian folklore and it's a Souls-like game. So, like Dark Souls. I mean, I've played it enough to say I wouldn't say it's totally like Dark Souls. In fact, it's kind of funny. The closest vibe I'm getting from it, not for the combat, but for the atmosphere, is probably Deathloop. Like the whole world is like falling apart and decayed, and parts of it just look like people have been partying and rioting and living it up for too long, and it hasn't been cleaned up and taken care of. Anyway, that's all beside the point. Let's talk about the benchmarks. Enotria uses Unreal Engine. I think it's Unreal Engine 5. I could be wrong on that. And it looks really nice. I mean, I think it looks great. And the best thing about this being a Souls-like is that, unlike From Software, who apparently doesn't know how to not have a 60 FPS frame rate cap, Enotria is uncapped. So you can run it as fast as your GPU and your CPU and everything can go. And that's important because, like, if you have a 144 hertz or a 240 hertz or even like a 360 hertz display, you don't want to be limited to 60 frames per second. Like, that's bullcrap. From Software, get your act together, fix it. I know you make games for the PlayStation, but when you port to PC, you should not have a frame rate cap. Okay, enough about that. I hate frame rate caps on PC. They're idiotic. Let's go ahead and look at Enotria performance. I've got 8 GPUs ranging from ultra budget, the RX 6600 and RTX 3050 8GB, up to high-end, very high-end RX 7900 XTX and RTX 4080 Super. So we'll start with 1080p medium. You can see I've got the budget cards running in the background showing the video. As always, the video capture was done separately from my actual benchmark capturing of frame times. So performance tends to be a little bit lower in the top left area of the video feed just because you're capturing and encoding video at the same time as you're running the game. So pay attention to the chart numbers if you really want to do apples to apples comparisons. RX 6600 and 3050 run the game just fine at 1080p medium. This is without any FSR or DLSS or XeSS upscaling, all of which are supported. The 3050 is a little choppier at times. Like, there's just little hitches and stutters, probably due to having 8GB, but the 6600 also has 8GB, so we can't say too much there. 4060 and 7600 XT. Now, one of these has 16GB, the other has 8GB. The Nvidia card has 8GB, and their performance is pretty similar. In this case, the 7600 XT is faster, so that indicates maybe AMD's extra memory is helping, but partly I just think the game seems to favor AMD's architecture a little bit more here. It is a pure rasterization game. There's no ray tracing. Minimum FPS seems to be a little bit better on AMD's cards as well. Overall, you're getting over 170 frames per second on the top cards, which both the 7900 GRE and 7900 XTX beat the 4080 Super at 1080p medium. We're probably hitting CPU limits there, so don't read too much into that. 4070, it's almost as fast on average FPS as the 4080 Super, so again, CPU limits are likely a factor, but minimum FPS was quite a bit lower. And you can see 4060 and 7600 XT, they're pretty close with AMD having a slight advantage. The 3050 is normally slower than the 6600, so that ranking isn't a surprise. Okay, let's move on. 1080p Ultra, we'll start quickly with 6600 and 3050, both of which are struggling at native 1080p Ultra settings. I mean, like, the 6600 is doing better. It's maintaining 30 FPS or more, whereas the 3050, you'll see the minimum, the 1% lows keep dropping below 30, and you'll get these little hitches and stutters. It's not a great experience. Probably, again, VRAM is an issue. The 7600 XT and 4060, they're almost twice as fast as the 3050 in terms of this game, but the 7600 XT is again doing a little bit better, a little bit smoother, getting almost 60 frames per second, though not quite up to 60. And then as we move into the mid-range mainstream GPUs, the 7900 GRE and 4070, AMD's again got the advantage, and that's pretty typical of the 7900 GRE in a rasterization based game like this. It's got extra memory bandwidth, And so, it's getting about 100 frames per second on average compared to 87 on the 4070. While at the top, we've got the 7900 XTX and 4080 Super, both sitting at around 125 frames per second, with the AMD card having a slight lead. It's at 128 FPS. Cranking things up to 1440p, now we start to separate the men from the boys when it comes to your GPU. We'll just go ahead and skip the lowest tier cards and jump straight to the 4070 and the RX 7900 GRE. And you'll also see in the charts I've got some FSR with frame gen results for the 3050 and 6600, just because that was basically needed to get those to a playable level at 1440p. But the 7900 GRE and the 4070 are doing pretty well. 4070 is just coming in below 60 frames per second, while the GRE is at 71 frames per second. So again, like, clear advantage for AMD here. And then as we move into the extreme cards, 7900 XTX and 4080 Super, average frames per second is nearly tied at 94 and 93 FPS, with AMD having a slight lead. 1% lows again favor AMD a little bit more, but both cards are very playable at 1440p, and you can see that in the overall chart. Keep in mind the FSR plus frame gen results for the 6600 and 3050. So those are using quality mode upscaling. So they're really rendering at, like, it's just below 1080p. It's like, I don't know the numbers, 1708 by 936. I can't remember the exact numbers, but less than half the number of pixels if I have my math right. And you can see that does help them. Frame generation, though, is providing about a 50% boost, 60-70% maybe above that. So, without frame generation, they would not be that playable. With frame generation, they look smooth, but they're still hitching quite a bit because, 60 frames per second with frame generation has 30 frames per second input. So keep that in mind. 4K, our final resolution. We've dropped the bottom two cards, those older 6600 and 3050 from the charts because they simply couldn't handle it. And you can see 7600 XT and 4060 also can't handle 4K native. In fact, even the 4070 and the 7900 GRE are just barely getting past 30 frames per second, while the 7900 XTX and 4080 Super are up around 50-51 frames per second. So they're playable, but it's not like super smooth, super great experience. And this is where upscaling and frame generation can make sense, and we'll get to that next. But here you can see the overall charts. So I guess 3 of the GPUs are playable. The 4070 is borderline at native, so it really needs some help, and then the 7600 XT and below are definitely not a great experience. So let's turn on upscaling with frame generation, and this was interesting because FSR 3 upscaling and frame gen worked just fine on the 3050. But when I tried it on the 4060, 4070, 4080 Super, something went wrong. I don't know if I needed to restart the game. I could look into that, but I could not get results from those that were different from the 1440p results native. So, let me clarify that. 4K with quality upscaling renders at 1440p and then upscales to 4K. And frame generation should then provide a boost on top of that. And so my performance on the Nvidia cards with FSR 3 upscaling and frame gen was basically the same as my 1440p native results, meaning FSR 3 was not working on them for some reason, and it might be that the game detected an RTX 40 series card and got confused, whatever. But DLSS 3 with frame gen worked on them, and FSR 3 worked on the AMD 7000 series cards, and so that's what I'm showing here. So we've got FSR 3 3.1, I'm not sure, on the XTX and GRE and 7600 XT. And then we've got DLSS 3 frame gen with upscaling on the RTX 4080 Super, 4070, and 4060. Overall, this is where you want frame gen to be on the high-end cards. The 7900 XTX and 4080 Super are getting 120 to 150 frames per second. And that means like the game is rendering at 60 to 75 frames per second and then using frame gen to double that. And that's plenty fast on the input, so you don't really get upset about it. And that's a good experience. The GRE is pretty decent still at 105 frames per second, but that means now you're at 50-55 frames per second input. And then the 4070 is at 80 frames per second, which means it's at like 40 frames per second input, it's still playable. It's not bad, but you can start to detect a little bit of sluggishness if you know what you're looking for. And then finally at the bottom, the 7600 XT and 4060, 53 and 45 frames per second, you'd normally say, oh, that's actually quite playable. And you can do it in a pinch, but the frame gen on those means that you're really rendering at below 30 frames per second. Like it feels like 20 to 25 frames per second because that's what the game is running at and sampling your input at. And then you're doubling it with frame gen. So it's not a perfect experience. It's way better than the native 4K result. Like, let's be clear on that. You're going from 18 frames per second on the 7600 XT to 53 frames per second. It's not just frames per second, like it's really half of that plus frame gen, right? But it looks way better and it feels smoother and looks smoother, so it's a good result overall. Enotria, the last song, really kind of a surprising game to me. I think it's a lot of fun. It seems like it's got some clever storytelling and Italian folklore. I don't know anything about Italy or its folklore, so I think that could be fun to see. The game has a lot of verbiage that it throws at you early on where it's like, oh, you've got this, and this means like you're drunk, and so you're doing more damage but taking more damage is pretty much what it means. And then there's like 3 other things that you can get status effects as well that I don't even fully understand. But you don't need to understand them. So if you play through the tutorial at the beginning, you're like, whoa, there's a lot going on. Don't worry. Play the game some more. It kind of works itself out. And by the time you're a few hours into the game, you'll be familiar with the mechanics and what they mean. There's a lot of different weapons types. You've got giant swords, medium swords, short swords, rapiers, some maces and hammers and torches. They all have different attack speeds and such. But you'll have to learn the usual, watch for the enemy attacks and its patterns and then dissect them so that you can dodge at the right time sort of thing. It's a Souls-like in that sense. I felt like maybe it was a little easier than a lot of the Dark Souls games, but I wouldn't say it's easy per se. And I was playing on the reduced difficulty mode, the normal mode, not the hard mode. So, cut me some slack there as well. I'm not that much of a gamer that I can handle the get good mentality. Enotria, the last song. It's been out for a few days. Runs well on most cards with the right settings. Just don't expect 4K native to scream along on anything less than a 4090. Thanks for watching. Let me know what else you'd like to see tested and benchmarked in the comments. Give me a like and a subscribe, and we will see you next time.